Welcome to Stories, Fables, and Ghostly Tales, where you can get your weekly fix of scary stories, true encounters, and ghastly tales. Today's episode is a short story. The title of this short story is Evil Apartment by RILEY WEIDLER. How did I get here? Locked away in the mental health ward of a New York City hospital? I shouldn't have told my parents what happened, or have gone to the police when they refused to believe me. I know that what I saw was real, but the doctors have planted seeds of doubt in my mind. I must write this down to organize my thoughts. There must be a way to prove to the world that what I experienced was real, and to protect others from sharing the fate that I so narrowly escaped. Evil lurks in the darkest, deepest corners of New York City, and it is only a matter of time before innocent people are killed. It was the first day of work, and of course I was late. Rushing through my morning routine, trying to ignore my apartment's rattling and gasping pipes, as I showered and brushed my teeth. The last thing I needed was for a pipe to explode in the apartment I'd just moved into the previous night. I navigated unopened cardboard boxes as I made my way to the ancient oak wardrobe that had been left in the apartment by the previous tenant. Thank God I took the time to iron my clothes last night, I muttered as I pulled on my best blouse, a grey pair of slacks, and slipped into my favourite pair of black flats. I checked myself in the mirror and forced a smile while trying to ignore the paint peeling from the walls and cardboard chaos laying on the floor behind me. If only I could go back in time, back to the carefree days of living in luxury dorms with my friends at New York University. Unfortunately, I graduated, and the fairy tale of college was over, and now I had to face reality. I took out too much in loans to afford New York University, and now was living in a rundown apartment building in the worst part of Brooklyn. My friends, most of whom had wealthy parents, moved onto luxury apartments in trendy Manhattan neighborhoods. They promised me that they would visit, but I knew that it would never happen. My new apartment was only a few miles away from them, but the divide between New York City's rich and poor meant that I might as well have been living in China. I took a deep breath, resigned myself to my new life, and stepped out of my apartment, hoisted my fake designer bag onto my shoulder, and walked down the hallway towards the archaic elevator. Being an adult sucks, I muttered. My apartment building in Washington Terrace was all I could afford. I tried to imagine the building when it was first built, back during Prohibition, but I could not see past the blackened and sagging wooden floors, crumbling plaster walls, and rusted metal pipes that always seemed to be moaning, hissing, and dripping. I lived alone on the 13th floor, and apart from my landlord and a few monstrous cockroaches, had not yet met any of my neighbours. Standing at the doors to the elevator, I pressed the button for the ground floor a few times before I realised the button lights were burned out. I passed the time waiting for the elevator by trying to guess how many apartments were on my floor. I counted 12 doors on my floor, which meant that there were likely 240 separate units in the building. I'd only lived here for a few nights, but it seemed strange that I hadn't seen or heard any of my neighbours. No loud music, footsteps from the apartment above, or any children running down the hallways. Maybe it was mostly retirees that lived here. That might explain the deathly silence. There were technically 2 elevators servicing the 20 floors of the building, but the landlord, Miss Leary, told me that elevator 1 had been out of service for years. She would not give any details on when or if it would be fixed. Not that it matters much, since no one else seemed to live there. I stood staring at the elevator doors, lost in thought, and jumped as the elevator doors slid open with a loud bang to reveal a tiny elevator with clouded mirrors covering all 3 walls. I stepped in and pushed the black button with the letter G for ground floor. A minute passed and the elevator doors had not yet closed. I pushed the button a few more times with my thumb, but nothing happened. Great, just great, I muttered to myself. I sighed and began to step out of the elevator, resigning myself to finding the stairs. The elevator dropped a few inches as I was halfway out of the elevator, 1 foot in the hallway, 1 foot still in the elevator. I stood there for what seemed like eternity, frozen with fear, terrified that any sudden movement might cause the elevator to drop again. At that moment, the brass light fixtures lining the hallway began to flicker, randomly at first, then together, on, off, on, off. I looked down the hall and saw Miss Leary, the landlord, standing at the end. No, not standing. Hovering. I remember closing my eyes tight, not believing what I saw, and praying that I would open my eyes to find that this was all a bad dream. That I would soon wake up and find myself in my dorm at New York University. I opened my eyes again to see Miss Leary had moved a little closer. A long white gown hung limply from her thin, pale body. The lights continued to flicker. Miss Leary somehow had moved a little closer each time the lights turned back on. Her head hung forward, chin to her chest, grey matted hair covering her face. I willed myself to move, to run down the carpeted hall in the opposite direction, to the staircase, but my legs refused to cooperate. I stood there as if in a trance, paralyzed with fear. The light began to flicker faster and faster, bringing Miss Leary closer and closer until she hovered directly in front of me. The smell of death and decay stung my nostrils, her off-white gown loosely draped over her frail frame. Miss Leary hovered, with the tips of her toe lightly brushing the dirty floor. The elevator shuddered again, and at that moment, Miss Leary's head snapped up. An unseen force pushed me back into the elevator at the exact moment that I heard a loud snap from above. I slammed against the back of the elevator and crumpled to the ground. The elevator dropped a foot, and I looked up at Miss Leary to see her face. She no longer had the face of a sweet old lady that had given me a tour of the apartment. Miss Leary looked down at me with empty, worm-filled eye sockets, and a lipless mouth sneering at me with a permanent grin. There was another loud snap, and my stomach flipped as the elevator hung in midair for a moment before hurtling downwards. Time seemed to slow down as the elevator flew past each floor. I remember counting each floor through the open doors as the elevator rocketed through the shaft. Emergency brakes activated at the lobby and showered me with sparks as the elevator car screeched to a halt. I crawled out of the elevator, choking on a noxious cloud of dust and smoke. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my sleeve. Now out of the elevator, I slowly rose to my feet with one hand on the concrete wall for support. A sharp pain shot my leg as I gingerly tried to move forward. Not broken, just sprained. I whispered through clenched teeth, trying to ignore the pain in my ankle. I hobbled forward with one hand on the wall. Somehow I was calm. The initial rush of adrenaline had left. And now I was only left with a feeling of grim determination. I could only move forward and hope to find a staircase leading out of the basement. A cold gust of wind blew down and out of the elevator shaft, carrying the sound of laughter with it. At first I thought it was the sound of the wind blowing through the elevator shaft, but it became louder and more hysterical with each passing moment. I quickened my pace, ignoring the sharp pain in my leg, and tried to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm me as I moved through the dark corridor. I stumbled along in the darkness, waiting for my eyes to adjust, desperate to find some way out. A faint, pulsing light caught my attention, and I walked towards it like a moth being pulled towards a porch light. I stood before a solid concrete wall that had a large hole in it, like something I had burrowed through. I stepped through into a large room with a slick stone wall illuminated by a glowing door. The floor was littered with personal effects, clothes, purses, wallets, and some looked to be over 100 years old. I gingerly stepped over a cracked pair of horn-rimmed glasses, kicked away a faded newspaper with a headline reading, "Pearl Harbor attacked," and placed my hands on the door. I was surprised at the warmth radiating from the wooden surface of the door. My hand explored engravings in the wood worn smooth by time. At the top of the door I found a faint imprint of letters. Standing on the tip of my toes, I allowed the tips of my fingers to trace the letters carved into the smooth wooden door. As if I was reading Braille, I discovered "Abandoned Hope." A cold gust of wind pushed me against the door, and I heard the faint sound of laughter from behind me. I moved my fingers across the words more quickly, hoping that my salvation lay in whatever message had been engraved in the door. "All who enter here." A running hand, blood-caked under impossibly sharp fingernails, reached over my shoulder and pushed a lever hidden within the door. I watched as the door slowly opened, revealing a narrow spiral staircase. The hand withdrew, lightly brushing a fingernail across the side of my cheek. A moment passed, and I gathered the courage to look back. There was nothing. I was alone in the empty room once again. I had nowhere else to go. I traced my steps back to the elevator, and checked every nook and cranny in the corridor for another way out. The only way out was down the staircase. I made my way back and descended into the pitch-black staircase, one hand on the smooth stone wall, the other hand reaching out blindly in front of myself. I knew that I was deep beneath the streets of New York City, that this staircase led to somewhere very ancient. The spiral staircase descended into a cavernous hall illuminated by smoky torches set deep into the walls stained black with soot. A coldness washed over me as I stepped into the room, despite standing in between two large torches set on either side of the entrance into the hall. Heavy oak coffins lined the wall of the hall, lined up tall against the stone walls. As I walked down through the hall, I found that some of the coffin lids were open, but thankfully they were empty.
"Welcome to the Hall of the Dead, my friend. You may call me the King,"
said a deep voice. I spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but the hall appeared to be empty, well, except for the coffins lining the walls. A soft glow appeared towards the end of the hall, opposite from the staircase I'd entered from.
"Yes, walk closer,"
said the voice in a soft whisper. I obeyed and fought the urge to look over my shoulder, terrified of what might lurk behind me. A robed man with tattooed skin and hair so white that it seemed to glow sat upon a tarnished silver throne.
"Welcome to my kingdom. Step closer, my dear,"
he said, beckoning me closer with his hand. My body began to move towards him, even as my mind screamed silently in terror. My trance was broken by a muffled scream rising from the coffin close to my right. The coffin began to rock back and forth, and the sound of fists and feet pounded against the lid of the coffin.
He still has a little fight left in him, doesn't he? He's been in there since yesterday. He had just moved into the apartment beside yours,"
said the figure sitting passively on the throne.
"Miss Leary, would you be so kind as to open the coffin to the right of Mr. Newton, so that he might have some company?"
said the man with a slight smile. The skeletal Miss Leary appeared from behind the Duke and glided down an empty coffin that stood next to Mr. Newton's coffin. She opened the coffin lid and turned to face me, her empty eye sockets staring at me.
"I hope for your own sake that you make this easy. Miss Leary can be very persuasive if the need arises,"
said the man. Miss Leary flexed her fingers, her razor-sharp fingernails somehow glimmering in the dull torchlight. I began to shuffle towards the open coffin, with my head bent down, pretending as if I had accepted my fate. Miss Leary, rather the thing that used to be Miss Leary, stepped towards me and opened the dusty coffin door a bit wider. Now, 5 feet from the coffin, I decided that I had to try something, anything, or else I would die a slow, painful death within one of these coffins, or worse yet, end up like Miss Leary. I pretended to stumble, falling towards the coffin containing Mr. Newton. My hand found the latch holding the coffin lid in place. Mr. Newton, or what was left of Mr. Newton, flew out of the cage, more animal than human. His hands were mangled beyond recognition, as if someone had taken large bites out of him. His cheeks were painted black with dried blood. Empty sockets stared in my direction. He took one unsteady step towards me, and then raised his nose to the air. He sniffed once, and let out a blood-curdling scream that I will never forget. He charged towards the man on the throne and dragged him off his chair. Miss Leary stood in front of the open coffin that had been meant for me, her torn face staring blankly ahead. I realized that she must only act on the direct instructions of the tattooed man, incapable of independent thought. This was my chance. I dashed forward and pushed Miss Leary into the open coffin. Recoiling in disgust as my hand sunk into her rotting flesh, I slammed the heavy oak lid and made sure the latch was securely fastened. I turned around to see Mr. Newton's face burrowed in the pale neck of the tattooed man. As I sprinted past the pair, I gathered enough courage to glance down and saw the tattooed man smiling up at me.
"What is dead cannot die. No one can remove a king from his rightful kingdom,"
he whispered as I darted past him. A loud roar came from behind me, echoing loudly in the hall. I paused to look over my shoulder, and saw that every coffin had opened, and that figures in various states of decay were beginning to emerge.
"Finish him,"
cried the man. 100 corpses collapsed on top of Mr. Newton, muffling an inhuman cry of despair. A surge of adrenaline rushed through my body, and I took off running in the opposite direction. I found an open door behind the throne and rushed through it and up the set of stairs that I came across. I eventually found my way out of the labyrinth, through an abandoned subway tunnel, and into the sewers. I climbed up the first ladder I found and collapsed onto the street in front of the apartment building. I slumped to the ground and sat on the curb in front of the entrance to the building, ignoring the pouring rain that was beginning to soak through my clothes. A sleek black car pulled up in front of me, with an Uber sticker in the window. The rear window rolled down, and I could see 3 of my best friends from New York University sitting on the plush leather seat, phones in hand, and dressed according to the New York fashion trends.
What on earth are you doing out in the rain? We've been calling you all day. We wanted to celebrate your first day of work,
said my old roommate Lindsay. It started, I began to say, but was interrupted by Rosa, who said, "Your cheek is bleeding. It looks like someone cut you." Still dazed from the morning's terror, I put my hand to my cheek and winced as I felt the deep groove of a cut. "Let's get you to your apartment, get you cleaned up," said Lindsay. They got out of the car and began to lead me back to the entrance of the apartment. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw Miss Leary standing behind the glass door of the entrance. Except this was the original Miss Leary, the sweet old lady with blue eyes and that smell of lavender perfume. She smiled at me, and for a split second, I saw her as she truly was, the servant of the tattooed man, with razor-sharp fingernails, rotting skin, and empty eye sockets. Something snapped inside of me. Without a word to my friends, I took off running down the street, running as fast as I could, knowing that I just had to get as far away from the apartment as possible. What an amazing story. If you like this story, click that like button, because there's more to come. Subscribe and you'll get them as soon as I make them. Join me on Twitter at StoriesFablesGT, and visit my Facebook page at Stories Fables Ghostly Tales. Spread the word, be ghostly, be scary, and join me next time on Stories, Fables, and Ghostly Tales. Take care.